on what is happening in Cuba and their specific interest in solidarity. So let me introduce the speakers firstly before we watch part 1, which is 12 minutes of the documentary series. So I'll start off, we had a little discussion earlier, but I'll start off with the speakers as I know them. So I'll start off with Sheppy. Sheppy I met when I was still in high school. So that was 5 years ago, Sheppy. That's what I tell people anyway, that I'm still 29.
I can't find Sheppy now.
Okay, so yeah, so I met Sheppy in the lounge of the Harnickers. He'll remember quite well, where we had these long, intense discussions about the ultra-left, solidarity, and so on. And that was still in the good old days of apartheid. Fast forward to today, Sheppy, I think you all know him. Marcus was quite pleased when he saw him earlier, but Sheppy has had a long history of engagement within the research, heritage, history, and education arena. In this regard, he has devoted more than 20 years to the heritage, media, and communication sector in South Africa. He's worked for a broad range of organizations, including public and community broadcasters and civil society organizations. Besides being a champion of heritage and history education, he has a long track record in community development. He was a researcher and co-author of groundbreaking heritage research projects of the South African Human Sciences Research Council. He co-authored a book, The Other Side of Freedom, and he also co-authored a report entitled The Liberation Struggle and Liberation Heritage Sites in South Africa. Freedom, and he also co-authored a He's got a passion for community journalism and specifically radio as a medium to promote citizen agency and reflect a diversity of voices in community development. He has an impressive academic record. He holds a B.Journal from Rhodes University, an advanced diploma from Manchester University, an MEd and an MPhil from University of Western Cape and Stellenbosch, respectively. He's currently at Rhodes University, where he lectures on audio journalism, the School of Journalism and Media Studies. So from the humble lounge of the Harnickers to the corridors of Rhodes University. Welcome, Sheppy, and thank you for being part of today. So the next person that I'm going to introduce is Chrisen Pather. And Chrisen tumbled into my life, I would say, when we were both at university. And Chrisen had a lot more hair. I see all his hair is gone now. Yeah, so Chrisen is really a development executive in the media industry. And like Sheppy, he's also worked in heritage and education, development, and mainstream communication. He's spearheaded groundbreaking social behavior communication initiatives in South Africa, and he holds a Bachelor of Social Science from the University of Cape Town. He joined Times Media as a producer in 1997 and played a strategic role in the organization's growth strategy, extending the footprint for edutainment content. He is an executive member of the team that developed a range of dynamic, socially relevant content. And you will recognize many of these names: The Molo Show, Gazalam, Kwanda, Noma Kanjani, etc. Chrisen is one of the co-founding members of the channel head of the Good Life Network It's South Africa's first health, fitness, and lifestyle pop up channel broadcast on DSTV and currently serves on the board of HIV SA as a non executive director. Hussein, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your input later on.
Well, thank you.
Last but not least is Comrade Professor Robbie van der Kerk. And I say that because he asked me to remove the professor from the billing today. But you're all familiar with Robbie. And I think many of us will recognize the work that he's done. So I'll start with the 1980s, where he served as an anti-apartheid youth organizer in the structures of the UDF and the Mass Democratic Movement. He then, in the 90s, he chose to focus his contribution to national liberation and social emancipation through academic work, where he worked as a senior researcher for the Education Policy Unit at UWC. He completed his PhD at Oxford University, and in 2011, he became the director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. Importantly, I think for today, there's a lot of overlap. He took up the position of Professor of Public Governance at the Wits School of Governance in 2018. His current research, writing, and publication is on the universalization of healthcare, the history of social policy and inequality, and the role of Black intellectuals. He co-leads an ongoing project entitled Cultures of Social Solidarity and Social Emancipation, reflecting on Cuba in Southern Africa, with colleagues at the University of Havana, as well as academic colleagues in Angola and Mozambique. He currently serves as a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on the NHI. So you can see we have a robust panel today, and they are ideally placed to provide input into today's discussion. Okay, so let's look at the okay, so Fart is now going to play a message of support for us. The message of support is from ICAP. ICAP is an international community organization that was formed many decades ago to promote solidarity with Cuba.
Dear friends, on behalf of the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the People, we would like to send our warm greetings to the participants in this webinar, organized by the member of Friend of Cuba Society in Cape Town, extended to the rest of the great family of Focus in different provinces, who, for years, have offered their sincere solidarity to our people. Thanks to our Embassy of Cuba for the permanent support too. Special greetings to Reverend Father Michael Axley, a permanent defender of just causes and the Cuban Revolution, president and founder of Focus Chapter in that beautiful city of Cape Town. It is also a great satisfaction award in other part of the world, as our historical leader Fidel Castro expressed in many occasions. Those young students who were part of the Cuban family for many years of studies in our island, and to our Cuban doctors who are always accompanying our sister countries, saving life, representing the internationalism of Cuba, especially to the Henry Reed International Brigade that is facing this terrible pandemic in many countries of the world. We also take this opportunity to thank the Solidarity Movement in South Africa, the government, personalities, and all the South African people for the efforts and permanent support to Cuba in different scenarios. And at the same time, we invite you to continue promoting solidarity actions focused on the battle against the blockade that the United States government has unjustly imposed on Cuba for more than 60 years. The fight for the return to Cuba of the territory illegally occupied by the USA in Guantanamo, and to redouble actions in support of just causes that demand the support of men and women of goodwill like you. Finally, we wish you success and that you may continue to advance in the implementation of your future projects aimed at strengthening a more prosperous society, always accompanied by the wisdom of Madiba. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ICAP, for that message of support. It resonated, the theme and the words resonated so much with us. I saw many of you nodding, Habiba especially, and we want to take those words of support from ICAP into today's deliberations. Okay, so we're going to watch the screening first for the next 12 minutes, and then we'll have the meat of today, which is the contribution by the panel. They've also indicated that they're happy to go over the hour that's been allocated. So we'll try and keep to time, but if required, we might have to go over 4 p.m. Okay, so let's watch The War on Cuba, Part 1.
Hi, I'm Liz. People come to Havana looking for the real Cuba, and this is what they do. But this is not my Cuba. My Cuba isn't so romantic, but I'm happy here. I love my country. Cuba is safe. We've got free healthcare and education. I graduated from university without paying a penny, and I became a journalist. Pero lo mejor que tiene Cuba es su gente. But we've got one huge problem, the economy.
¿La situación está mala?
Malísima.
Fea. Pésimamente mal.
Está difícil.
Estresante.
Caótica.
Es candela. Ahora mismo está fatal.
A mí ni me preguntan.
During the pandemic, people have to wait in line for hours just to buy food. Aquí la cosa está dura. COVID. I'm used to this. I grew up in crisis.
Hey everybody, it's Tony Robbins. Listen, I'm reaching out to you right now because I'm mad. I hope you are too. I'm so tired of people living in fear.
Sorry.
Y no es embargo ni bloqueo. Es guerra.
The legislation I signed today further tightens that embargo. By maintaining our embargo,
El bloqueo económico persiste.
Cruel e insensato bloqueo que haya existido contra naciones.
Our government blames pretty much everything on the US embargo. They call it the blockade. ¿Es que lo queman mucho? We get bored of hearing about the blockade all the time. But it's real. The United States has been waging war against Cuba for 60 years. It's not a war with bullets or bombs, but it touches every aspect of our lives. Recently, more than ever. ¿Cómo está Ernesto? Buenos días. ¿Está listo para trabajar en el campo hoy?
Hay personas que me conocen de 25 años y no saben que me faltan las piernas.
¿Me puede mostrar sus prótesis?
Sí, como no. Estas son de aluminio y fibra de plástico. No tienen ni articulación, son rígidas. Y se puede partir por aquí. Y entonces la parte del pie poder partir también. Una vez por aquí cargando un saco de yuca, se me partió por aquí. Porque mi hija, ya te digo que cuando esto se rompe, el problema.
This is where Ernesto goes to get his prosthetics, free of charge. But Ernesto can't get the specialized prosthetics he needs because it's illegal for Cuba to buy them. ¿Y existen unas prótesis un poco más resistentes que usted le pudieran servir más?
Existen unas prótesis más resistentes, con más calidad, caminaría mejor, incluso podía trabajar mucho más, pero no tenemos acceso a ellas por el bloqueo.
Ernesto doesn't complain. In Cuba, we've lived with scarcity for so many years, we take it for granted. The blockade is the longest trade embargo in modern history. It isn't motivated by concerns about human rights. It's about money and power. Until 1959, Cuba was like a US colony. Our economy was controlled by US companies, corrupt politicians, and the mafia. After the revolution, Cuba nationalized the US companies. We claim our sovereignty, our right to govern ourselves. The government gave basic rights to the majority: women, black people, campesinos, the working class. The blockade was retaliation. It's basically a form of economic warfare. The blockade stops Cuba from doing business with the United States. They can't buy our stock, and we can't buy theirs. And we can pay for things because banks won't lend us money, or even let us open accounts. The blockade also stops Cuba from doing business with other countries. That's not all. The blockade also locks us out of a big part of the internet. We're used to getting bad news from the United States. But 5 years ago, llegaron por primera vez buenas noticias de la Casa Blanca.
Does not serve America's interests or the Cuban people to try to push Cuba towards collapse.
A friend of mine said I should try Miradal. By using Miradal, I'm now
Sorry,
confident
people.
and I can smile all day long.
Obama announced new relations with Cuba. He began by loosening the blockade. U.S. airlines and cruise ships started taking tourists to Havana. Business was booming. Clandestina became Cuba's first independent design store in 2015. Idania is Clandestina's co-founder. She started the store after Cuba opened its economy to private business.
Clandestina pretende establecer el trabajo de los jóvenes diseñadores cubanos.
After Idania met Obama, Clandestina became a symbol of Cuba's new private sector.
Havana was like overcrowded, celebrities, musicians, politicians, everybody. It was insane. Chanel runway, Fast and the Furious shooting, Rolling Stone concert. The mood was anything is possible, all this sense of change, and finally to be aware of I have a future here. I can stay here. I don't have to leave my country. But then Trump won the election, so.
But all of the concessions that Barack Obama has granted the Castro regime were done through executive order, which means the next president can reverse them. And that I will do.
The Trump administration is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba.
John Bolton making a South Florida stop today to talk to the Cuban-American community.
Unveiling sweeping changes to Cuba policy. A major blow to the new U.S.-Cuba relationship.
U.S. has banned flights.
All families to leave Cuba.
The U.S. government will also ban trips by cruise ships.
Have to go after their finances, limiting the amount of money, fresh U.S. sanctions.
It's part of a trend.
U.S. tourism stopped. And if you don't have tourism, you don't have business. No tourism, zero remittances, no trade at all. You are suffocating the private sector. You are suffocating the Cuban people.
Since COVID, things have gone from bad to worse. ¿Tiene ibuprofeno por casualidad?
No, mamita, eso está en baja.
¿Y warfarina?
Tampoco.
¿Y metformina?
Tampoco.
¿Y Nalapin?
Eso está en baja.
You'd think the US might loosen the embargo during a pandemic. No. Recently, 2 Swiss companies refused to sell Cuba ventilators because they were owned by a larger US company. And a US-owned airline wouldn't take a donation of masks and ventilators to Cuba. On top of all that, the Trump administration made it even harder for our family members in the US to send us money.
The Trump administration has killed a deal that would allow Cuban baseball players to play for Major League Baseball.
El bloqueo afecta hasta nuestro deporte nacional. Cian Vega is one of Cuba's top young baseball prospects.
Running's the best way to lose weight, right? That's actually wrong. It's actually...
Desde chiquito siempre mi papá me inculcó entrenar, me llevaba todos los días a la pelota. Empecé a ver mi talento a partir de los 13, 14 años. Hay ya bastantes peloteros cubanos en la MLB que se han formado aquí en Cuba. Representar a mi país en el más alto nivel, que es la MLB, sería mi sueño, la verdad. Trump, cuando nos cerró las puertas de firmar con la MLB, casi todos los peloteros se sintieron mal por esa noticia.
Claro, porque ahora, en caso de que tú quisieras jugar con la MLB, tendrías que renunciar.
Tendría que renunciar a mi país, no me gustaría, la verdad. Me gustaría jugar y volver a mi país, vivir con mi familia, no estar lejos de ella.
For his rivals, tonight just might be the last big chance to stop Donald Trump.
It's hard to believe now, but 5 years ago, some Cubans thought a Trump presidency wouldn't be that bad.
Si me tuviera que escoger, yo escogería a Donald Trump.
Y sabe que Cuba tiene un mercado virgen.
Y él le interesaría mucho invertir en Cuba. Entonces no creo que todo ese proceso que ha ocurrido lo eche para atrás.
That same month, Trump's executives were visiting Cuba and playing golf here. It wasn't the first time Trump tried to do business in Cuba. This is the website for La Oficina Cubana de Propiedad Industrial. It's where foreign companies apply to do business in Cuba. In 2008, Trump registered his brand name for hotels, casinos, beauty contests, television programs, and golf courses.
I'm okay with the Cuban situation, but I want to tell you they should be making a good deal.
So what or who made Trump change his position on Cuba?
Guys, we have a con artist as the front runner in the Republican Party.
Thank God he has really large ears, the biggest ears I've ever seen.
And you know what they say about men with small hands?
Rubio, total lightweight.
If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
Trump's fight with Rubio didn't last long.
A man that's really become a friend of mine, Senator Marco Rubio. Great guy.
After Trump won, they became allies. Trump let Rubio pick his Latin American team, and Rubio wrote Trump's new Cuba policy.
I have wonderful memories from our visit during the campaign. It was right before the election. I guess it worked, right?
Trump's war in Cuba has won him the support of powerful Cuban-American businessmen and politicians like Marco Rubio. They helped him win Florida, the country's biggest swing state, in 2016. And Trump believes this is the way to win again in 2020.
I'm Cuban and support Trump.
I am so thrilled to be back here with all of my friends in Little Havana.
When US presidents say they are talking to the Cuban people, they're not talking to us. Because we don't get to vote in Florida. Pero los cubanos no cogemos lucha con la política de los Estados Unidos. El bloqueo está ahí, punto. Así que para adelante, que no hay más nada.
Thank you so much, Fatih. When we were discussing the logistics earlier, we looked at what could go wrong, and we thought maybe the signal could drop, but we didn't accommodate the advertisements.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't. I used the wrong one. I downloaded and then I went onto the live YouTube. So sorry, my mistake.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. Okay, so we see how the economic war intensified under the Trump administration, and the story of the farmer and his prosthetic leg really resonated with me and touched me. I'm going to call on the speakers now in the following order, which they agreed: Comrade Robbie, then Comrade Chrisen, and then Comrade Sheppy, to give their input and perspectives, and they could reference the War on Cuba video clip. So Comrade Robbie, over to you.
Thank you, Comrade Sabiha. So, just in terms of some observational comments to begin with, I think to contextualize the blockade and the illegal on the part of the US, one has to locate it in terms of the history of Cuba and the triumph of the revolution in 1959, and the attempts of the US government to destroy the idea of Cuba and the idea of Cuba as a society which was transforming in the interests of the majority, in the interests of the impoverished, in the interests of the working class, and so forth, and trying to suggest that poor people self-organized with revolutionary leadership committed to social change, the social change of their society, can actually organize that society in ways that reflect self-reliance and reflects their ability to achieve their social goals without having to rely on Western nations or dominant powers. In the case of Cuba, it's America. So the revolution was about really overthrowing Cuba being the playground of the US. And the important point of departure there, that ideal that's reflected in the triumph of the revolution under Fidel, was what the US wanted to destroy. And of course, Cuba's consequent support of other revolutionary societies, stretching from 1962 in Algeria throughout the 1980s for Nicaragua, El Salvador, and so forth. So the idea of Cuba is very central to the Americans' attempt to overthrow that society. It's cast in this idea around democracy and a whole range of issues. But in a sense, at the heart of the intervention through the blockade is to starve the society of the possibility of establishing a socialist community, a socialist society, and to prevent the idea that poor people self-organize with revolutionary leadership, as reflected particularly under the leadership of Fidel, Che, Camilo Cienfuegos, Vilma Espen, that they could actually then pursue those goals, achieve those goals, and think that those goals could be sustained. And so the imposition of the blockade since 1960, we must reflect that what Cuba has been going through is essentially a society under war for decades, and which the Trump, and as reflected in the video, the intervention of Trump to deepen the blockade, to deepen the economic embargo, has to be seen in the context of that much wider history. And yet, what is fascinating about Cuba is, despite all these attempts to stop it from establishing itself as an alternative socialist society, it has still maintained its ability to achieve its social goals. So Cuba, as is well known, has comparatively the best healthcare system in the world, which is universally provided. That's now become agenda globally. Well, that agenda was established of universalization of healthcare, was established in Cuba in the 1960s already. And that means that Cuban citizens don't pay any cost from both the basic primary healthcare, which is the foundation of the Cuban healthcare system, to the most expensive forms of tertiary level healthcare. A Cuban citizen does not have to pay a single penny to secure that kind of healthcare resources. We can also compare that, of course, with our own country in South Africa, where there's such deep inequality that 50% of total health spending goes to service 16% of our own population who have the privileged access to the medical aid tax provisions. So the first thing to say is Cuba is a society that is transforming in a self-reliant way to meet its social goals and those of its citizens without having to rely on the dominant nations. The other thing to say is that the blockade occurred over many, many decades, and Cuba has been under siege and under war for these many decades, but it also, as reflected in the video on the prosthetics for that particular citizen, the Cubans have also been able to innovatively respond from within their own resources, and again, under the leadership of the revolutionary movement, in ways that meet those needs. So a reference was also made in the video to the attempts to block Cuba from accessing ventilators. Well, Cuba didn't throw up its arms and say, well, what can we do? It actually then pooled its resources internally, its technical expertise, which is at an incredibly high level, and actually manufactured its own ventilators. And I think that idea of self-reliance is at the very core of the Cuban process. But the effects, as also indicated in the video, has got this very deep human dimension where ordinary Cubans have to suffer the impact of the right-wing neo-fascistic ideological views of someone like Donald Trump, who strengthened the blockade. In fact, it constitutes 90 economic laws, and those laws are aimed at starving the country of its necessary resources. So here you have this narrative on the one side of a big power, like a dominant power, hegemonic power, like the US, trying to prevent the Cubans from actualizing their own social experiment, to being productive, to being developmental, to meet the social needs of its citizens. At the same time, Cuba is sending a very different message out globally. It's got the Henry Reeves Brigade, where you find over 7,000 medical doctors working in 27 countries, trying to stave off the worst effects of the pandemic to great success, including in northern countries like Italy, which didn't have the resources and the capacity to meet the scale of the effects of the pandemic in their countries. And that, again, must also be located historically. That's not a once-off. Cuban medical intervention goes back at least for the past 50, 60 years for countries in need, including, for example, in the 60s with Pakistan, when it was subject to an earthquake. And also in 2007 with the Ebola virus, it was the Cuban doctors who, with the foundation of the health response in many African countries in that time, dealing with the response to the Ebola virus. And it was, as indicated by the Cuban ambassador to Canada, she said, well, even Obama's secretary for Foreign Affairs was saying that the Cubans have done a good job. So here's this narrative, this parallel narrative of Cuba's immense solidarity with the world. And of course, we in South Africa have also been incredible beneficiaries of Cuba's global solidarity. And this other narrative where this society, the small Cuban island of 11 million people with minimal resources, playing this fantastic solidarity role through the healthcare provision across the world, is being starved of the ability not only to meet its own healthcare needs, but the needs of the global healthcare community. And so one has to ask oneself, in whose interest is the US undertaking this? In whose interest is it to destroy Cuba through this economic blockade? Because the impact is also on us. It prevents the Cubans' ability and to marshal the incredible expertise, the public health expertise, in ways that meet the needs not just of Cuba, but the rest of the global community. In a context where the head of the World Health Organization says that the one message coming out of the COVID pandemic has to be that we must find more socially solidaristic ways of being across the world. So America is actually plunging us back into almost a Cold War mentality, and plunging us back into a kind of an imperialist hegemonic politics that we saw playing out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that has to be challenged. And it's a challenge not just for Cuba, because at the heart of that attempt is to undermine Cuba's sovereignty as a nation. The one thing that the Cubans will not allow the US to do is to dictate to them, to return to the days when Cuba was the playground of the US. It also challenges the sovereignty of a nation like South Africa, because if it's today, it's Cuba, What's stopping America from tomorrow imposing the same kind of sanctions on South Africa because they don't like the kinds of political positions that the government may take in support of progressive humanity? So I think the one thing I would say in terms of understanding the blockade and what's happening in Cuba, that us as South Africans who stand in solidarity with Cuba, showing solidarity to Cuba, it's not a nice to have. It's not just something that we're doing because, you know, we feel such a depth of connection with Cuba. It's also very precisely that if we're interested in a world order that is based on social solidarity, pivotal to that is to maintain the Cuban Revolution, its goals and objectives, and the global beneficiaries of this, which is, you know, progressive humanity, through the incredible solidarity that Cuba has shown through its actions, in particularly in the Henry Reeves Brigade, which is been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's just some of my first initial observations. Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Robbie. Chrisen, are you ready?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for inviting us to participate in this event. I think it's important for so many reasons, and Robbie has raised some of them. So I think one of the big issues is what is the role of media in fighting for a more equitable and a just society, and how does media influence that transformation, or can media in its own actually do that? You know, so I think.
Sorry, Chrisen, is it possible for you to put on your video?
Okay.
If possible.
Thank you. So I'm saying one of the critical issues is around the role of media and what can media do to drive transformation and liberation. So in the context of the film, you know, what is being said and how is it being said? And I think what's interesting for me is the personalization of the story. So it moves from less a kind of propagandistic output to telling real stories through the persona of Liz. And what's interesting, if you look at the executive producer, Oliver Stone, who not too long ago had his film Comandante pulled from HBO. HBO refused to screen it. It was on Fidel Castro, you know. So you find that even in the construction of revolutionary films or movies that can make an impact, the networks of distribution are sometimes closed off and limits that impact. So, you know, what is the role of trying to promote just societies, and how does media interface with those with that goal? Liz's films is quite interesting, and I think the notion of people telling their own stories as opposed to parachute journalism is also something that we should support, because I do believe that through real stories we could get closer to help try to solve the problem. But I think in watching the documentary, some of the issues that come to mind is, what is the notion of opening up a blockade in terms of inverted commas free trade and globalization? I mean, how does globalization start to impact on economies and societies, and can that notion of trade ultimately deliver on the goals of freedom, or can they result in a more unequal society? And I'm not saying that lightly, but I'm saying, you know, we do need to consider, in the context of liberalizing kind of trade policy, or so, what is the ultimate outcome? And how does one ensure that agenda of pure commoditization being seen as freedom? And I think in the documentary, one of the participants raises the issues of cars. How many cars do you really need to have? So that's one issue. I think that there are other issues raised by Noam Chomsky, in that the blockade is the harshest that the world has ever seen by a superpower against a relatively small country that does not have the power or the machinations to act as a real threat. And Chomsky goes back to looking at what happened in the 1800s, where Cubans liberated themselves from the Spanish, and the Americans intervened to ensure that the Cuban people would be subjugated. So the nature of the punishment seems almost obscene in relation to what is going on from a kind of America being a superpower. I think the second thing that's important is the United Nations General Assembly has voted successively against the blockade. And the European Union has also gone as far as charging the World Trade Organization for some of the policies that the US has implemented. So in the context of the world being against the blockade, what do sort of organs of people's power, civil society organizations, NGOs, what can they contribute? What is their voice? And if that voice is to be through a form of media, then I think the things that we need to look at is how impactful is that media and how widely can we distribute the media. Oliver Stone talks about the density of ignorance, and I think he's referring to the American people. And in that sort of notion of the density of ignorance, what light can we shine into that space? And what responsibility do we have as content producers and storytellers to ensure that the truth actually gets out there and matters? So yeah, I think that in a nutshell is some of my reflections on the documentary.
Thank you, Christine. Once Sheppy has given his input, then I'll make a comment. Sheppy, are you ready?
Yes. I am, Saliha, thanks, and thanks
Thank you.
and thanks to the rest of the focus comrades, and as well as everybody who's here. Basically, my own reflections relate to the fact that, first of all, I was like highly moved by the fact that at last there is a documentary of this sort. It's short, it's quite powerful in the sense that it puts across the issues very clearly. And I like the use of visualization in the middle as well to kind of give a background to how the blockade has evolved and its implications on Cuba. And so the use of multiple techniques in order to convey information. And also, very importantly, I mean, it's been mentioned, the character of the main protagonist, Liz, and the fact that she's a journalist. And immediately I thought that journalism students of her age and below who are studying here in South Africa are one constituency that need to be reached by this documentary. And I'm now kind of riding on what both Robbie had said and Christian as well in their impressions and reflections, that one of the challenges that we have is this paradox of Cuba, which is the fact that it's quite an unjust blockade. It really is punitive. It even punishes third countries that do trade with Cuba. So it doesn't only punish, those who want to do direct trade with Cuba, but if South Africa also trades with Cuba, then you on the firing line of the United States, of this big bully in the world that's kind of abrogated that responsibility to itself, drawing this from a very unjust a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine, where, as far as they were concerned, the entire continent, from north to south was their backyard and nobody else's. So is this idea that whilst this is so unjust and it really, I mean, any reasonable person would be horrified about what is going on in terms of the implications of the blockade. On the other hand, the media has never I mean, I'm talking about mainstream media, has never touched the story of Cuba, has never touched. I know we're struggling in the early 2000, struggling just to find, stories that resonate around the campaign for the freedom of the Cuban Five. And fortunately, there was a powerful documentary that included the recently departed former, I think it was former, what is it, the Chief Justice equivalent of the United States. I forget his name now, it just escapes me. Anyway, he was a strong supporter of the campaign to end the lifting of, to end the blockade, and also very strong supporter of in fact, he even was part of the retrial of the Cuban Five by People's Tribunal. So we got that video. Once we got that video, then we translated it, because a large majority of our people still rely on radio in this country. And we translated, in fact, turned it into a radio program and got it to 65 community radio stations across the country. And that kind of content, there was an immediate recognition of how it resonates with our lives, with what we're about. And I think for me, we must find these kinds of connections. And with regards to this documentary, for instance, I'd been thinking that one of the areas that we need to expand to is, of course, university youth, that the kind of fees must fall generation that needs to hear this message. And as I said, anybody, whose heart beats, against injustice and will respond, very positively. Then there are groups of women, whether they are organized, and because we sometimes forget that women are the majority in our society, where they are organized at whatever level, that they need, this message needs to get through, that the mothers of Cuba, your counterparts in Cuba, are struggling, and often is because of conditions that have been imposed upon them of subjugation by a big superpower that just doesn't care. It thinks it's a policeman of the world. Then the other thing is to also address schools, because the learners at school, I think that it's an important constituency. This is the future of South Africa. The learners at school at two levels: at the level of exchanging with their counterparts in Cuba and writing letters to them. How are the Americans going to monitor, thousands of learners in South Africa writing letters to their Cuban counterparts? Anyway, the idea is that to swell the support in terms of human person-to-person relations with Cuba. Secondly, it will assist us to learn how a country, which is so small, an island, and with practically very little resources. It doesn't have all the kinds of resources. We've got platinum, we've got gold, we've got everything, but they don't have, as many resources as we have. And yet they've been able to address some of the developmental challenges, including free education. And then, of course, free healthcare. So is that how, and then children can learn what happens in the schools in Cuba. I had a fortune to go to Cuba somewhere around 2005, 2006. And I spent time with somebody from ICAP who took me through to schools. And I learned there something that still stays with me, where in each classroom, they strive to have three teachers. One teacher is a subject teacher. The other teacher is responsible for technology, audiovisual equipment, and so on. And then the third teacher is a psychologist. Their task is to monitor the behavior of the children and their development. If they pick up an issue, then say a child sleeps in class, and then they follow up, at home and try to address that. South Africa, why can't we do that? Why do we go to Australia, we go to Canada to seek models, we go to Britain to seek models, we even skip Burundi, next door, which has had an excellent a system of schooling at high school level where you are learning a trade whilst you are still at high school, so that by the time you reach matric, you're in equivalent in that skill of a junior degree at university. I mean, couldn't we learn from that? So it's, for me, is those possibilities, and using this documentary, I think it provides us with the tools to begin to engage at that level. Street committees, I mean, now we are challenged in our country to reimagine ourselves, because we have outsourced our power to politicians, to political parties, to the elite, which has really been a disaster. And I think it's high time for us to reclaim that power, you know, take it back in our hands as a people. And revival of street committees is very important, is at the center of that. Street committees corresponding with the committees of for the defense of the revolution, and beginning to engage with them, and beginning to learn how at a street by street level we can raise the standards of literacy and bring and learn from the Cubans, you know, about what they do. At this stage, we're just subject, because we're so disorganized, we're subject to all the propaganda and the commercial media is negative reporting about Cuban doctors, and quite shallow, you know, ill-informed as well. And it's and sinister, and it does certainly play to this agenda of the US of demonizing whatever Cuba is doing. So that, and then of course, I mean, our parliaments are very important, both at a national level and at a SADC level, and as well as at a Pan-African level. I think the Pan-African Parliament, those are our representatives. We'll send them there to represent us. So they must champion this cause. It's very important. It's at the center of our development challenges, not only as a region, but as a continent. And let me just stop there. I would have loved to see in the documentary, in terms of what I felt was kind of missing. Of course, I mean, I can't possibly, I mean, this is just too much, but I would have liked to hear about music, you know, young Cuban musicians, what are they doing, and how they've been impacted upon by the blockade, and as well as, of course, filmmakers and that sort of thing. That's all for now.
Wow, thank you to the speakers. That passion, that insight, the perspectives, thank you so much. There's so much to draw and extract from your contribution. So I'm going to be very brief, maybe starting with Comrade Sheppy, since he imbued us with his passion and his energy. He suggested many forms of intervention, and I'm hoping the comrades in Focus are listening. Comrade Sheppy, I also understand that you're a founding member of Focus, so perhaps now is the time to also rejoin the ranks and put some action to your very fiery and passionate words. But thank you for your insights. And then Comrade Chrisen, thank you so much. You spoke of the role of media, you referred to Chomsky. You allowed us to see and appreciate just how important storytelling is to bring about change, real change in the lives of ordinary people, and how the documentary, which is telling the story of ordinary people, is impacting. And we saw how Sheppy took that theme and showed how it can really change and transform society. And then when we come to Comrade Robbie, he contextualized the Cuban Revolution, the role that Cuba plays globally in terms of delivering services, not only in health, but in education. And I'm just looking to see if there are any contributions from people, any questions to the panel. I see here is one from Habiba. She is agreeing with Comrade Sheppy And then she says, sadly, in South Africa, it is not just the education of journalists, but mainstream education in general that remains lacking in nurturing critical thinking. And then she also says, the Cuban literacy campaign surely is one of the most empowering stories of self-organization in history, in human history. I should just mention at this point that a number of people have contacted me on WhatsApp and they couldn't, for some technical reason, get access to today's discussion, but they're watching it on live on Facebook. Okay, I wonder if there are any other comments, questions that people have in the remaining moments of today's event. Maybe you can just give an indication. Okay, I see one new message. I didn't actually read all of them.
But I think comrades can also just unmute themselves and talk, I'm sure, Saliha, if they have not the right to put it in the chat.
Saliha, may I?
Yes, please. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this was a wonderful event. Maybe small in numbers, but I think for focus, it is a good intervention at this stage. And I think all the point that all the speakers have made are very relevant. But I think, especially the point that Sheppy makes about how the Cubans organize. Of course, we also have a tradition like that issue of street committees. There's a lot of focus on social media and of course Zooms and so on, which is important. For example, in the children's movement, we started working on street formations. In fact, for the last 4 or 5 years now, we've organized children on a street level, structures are in the streets. And this has served us very well during this period, because there is what we don't really like this term, distance yourself socially. There must be social cohesion, but physical distancing. So yeah, I think the points that have been raised are very important. I think I'm sure it's recorded, and I think we should all use that as a basis for taking this process forward, so we can also make progress within our own country on the lessons that Cuba has to teach and has been teaching for many years. I think that's one of the weaknesses, I think, of our own system here, that we have not really, there's so much speak about how we have long association with Cuba, but it doesn't seem we've actually learned much from that very successful revolution. Oh yes, and my last point.
Oh, sorry.
It's
2 hands that are raised. Sorry.
The issue of people's power. We need to go back to that. You can see what 11 people under a strong, politically conscious, well-organized party is able to do. In fact, that's your main resource. Like Seppi was saying, that they don't have, or somebody was mentioning, they don't have gold and this and that, oil and all the other stuff. But what they've used is what they've done is to use the most important resource we have, and that's our people's agency.
Thank you, Comrade Marcus. Yes, absolutely. The Cuban model is something that we could definitely apply and learn from here in South Africa. Okay, so the 2 hands, who are they, Fatih?
Sheila and Herbert.
Okay, shall we start with Sheila? Do you have a question or a contribution?
Thanks very much, Saliha.
And just let me say, it's really lovely to see people. I mean, I haven't seen Robbie and Sheppy for at least 100 years.
Yes.
It's a long time ago.
Same with Marcus. Yeah.
And Robbie, I was just having memories of the strategic management team that we were with together under Comrade Brian. A long time ago that was. Although in the scheme of things, not so long. What I wanted to say is, you know, I think the important thing about particularly the literacy program, and I recall the woman who, and I don't recall her name, who was the first ambassador to Cuba after '94.
Tinjiwe.
Sorry?
Wasn't it Tinjiwe?
Yeah, it might have been. And she told us a story once about how everybody just downed tools for about a year or so and went out and taught people who could not read and write to do that. And she talked about the joy she had when there was a man who had signed everything with crosses and suddenly could write his name. And the entire village came around and just clapped it for him and just cheered him on that he could finally write his own name. But my comment about South Africa really is, I've been wondering for a while, how do we get this kind of cohesion, this kind of community spirit together? And I think part of the problem is the splintering on the left. And if the left forces, and I'm talking about really left, pretty much left of the ANC, because I don't count the ANC in these kinds of forces. If we can't get ourselves together around a whole lot of things, how are we going to actually make these kind of projects work? And I'm not saying that we all have to agree with each other politically, absolutely not. But is there not a space to build a broad left front, which would have some kind of defining features so that people would get together? Similarly, how the UDF brought together people, and not everybody was politically on the same space, but there was a kind of guiding moment that we're looking towards the freedom in South Africa. And I think that it's going to take some really smart thinking, that we get together and say, what are the baseline things that we on the left agree with, so that we can actually get together around campaigns like literacy, like, you know, whatever, those basic campaigns, like maternal to child stuff, like gender-based violence. And my head keeps spinning about that. I have some thoughts, but I won't take up your time, any more time. But I just wanted to drop that in for people to think about.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I wonder if I do see the other hand, but I wonder if we could ask the panel, all of them, or at least one of them, maybe just to give some initial feedback or comments to Comrade Sheila's contribution.
Okay, sorry, Comrade.
Okay.
I was deferring to my senior Comrade Sheppy, and he was very much saying, no, that's not what we do. So I think Sheila's comments are very critical. What Sheila's asking us to think wider about, and this picks up on Marcus's point about how do we deepen our own response to the example that Cuba has provided. We've had this long history of solidarity, but what has it meant for us in terms of our own society and putting our society on a very different trajectory than the one that we're currently on, which is this rampant embrace of corrupt neoliberalism. And I think, absolutely, I think that's very important. I think that is something we need to look towards. I think Sheppy has pointed to the importance of rediscovering organs of people's power. In fact, I'm in the province where one of the great architects of people's power lived in Lingeleshile. Of course, I speak of the great Comrade Matthew Goniwe. And there was that impetus, and you saw in Lingelishli how people self-organize. In fact, if anything, the nascent example of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution was Lingelishli under the leadership of Mathigoniwe in 1985, 1986, before that experience was destroyed by the apartheid regime. So I think we must also reflect that we do have histories, but those histories have been dug very deep. We need to excavate those histories of our own experience of people's power and see how that might link and how it can be further illustrated by the examples of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. One of the reasons why Cuba has been so incredibly successful in combating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is precisely because they had these Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the principle informing which is the health and the needs of my neighbor is my concern. And so they really had an infrastructure in place. So when COVID hit, they could mobilize it very quickly and ensure that Cuban citizens were protected by adequate information, but also adequate medical intervention, not in some externalized way. It was actually happening within the community. And to that idea of reforming the idea of, let's say, a broad left front, illustrated, for example, by the UDF, I think if we can get that inclusive movement and thinking about such an inclusive movement established, I think it would politically put our country into a very different trajectory. The trajectory is to say that political parties have a certain role, absolutely, but it actually must come from below. It must come from the organization of communities into organs of people's power that can reflect a much bigger agenda of social change coming from below. So I think that's a very important contribution on the part of Sheila. Thank you. Shippy, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, just to add maybe a small thing again, you know, there is already here, for instance, in Makanda, and I know it's happening in other towns as well. I mean, there is a case of Kolobin. Every time I think of Kolobin and I think of how the secretary, he was Secretary General of the ANC at the time, how he dealt with that, and that community was so self-organized that it was incredible, you know, what they were doing just there, and there was so many lessons for us. But here in Makanda, there are already forms of self-organizations against crime, because crime is rampant in the townships. And so a lot of, I mean, there's groups here. You'll hear if there's some criminal activity, you'll hear a whistle, and you know that street is quite organized, and everybody rallies and gets out and they deal with it. It happened to a relative of mine who lives here, who happens to be involved in criminal activities. And when I was visiting the house and the residents, I had to deal with them because they came looking for him and were going to deal with him. And in the course of discussion with them, of course, I mean, I was 100% with them because, you know, this chap has done a lot of things that shouldn't be done. Anyway, but there are also organized groups around cleaning, because this is a crime that organized workers who work for municipalities, if they are sent out to do repairs, they will arrive at the place of repair, say there's a burst pipe. They'll sit until 5 o'clock. Then at 5 o'clock, they start to work. And that happens almost invariably. And the thing is, and there are reports of how some, you know, were overheard talking about how I've bought a second quantum with the overtime money. So it's basically fleecing the system because they see the top leadership, you know, what it's doing. And then the people at the bottom also feel that, well, as I say in this course, so let us also, you know, chow, you know, it's our time to chow as well. So this ethic, this is very, very debilitating and you know, anyway, but the idea then is that the residents here decided, okay, they're not picking up rubbish. Let us do it ourselves here in the street. And once we pick up, we'll go and burn it, collect it together and burn it, and then we monitor. So nobody can again throw rubbish into this street. So there are already those forms of organization. And as I work with a young sort of student journalist, the orientation really is to get them to support this through information, investigative journalism, expose, take photographs of the workers when they're sitting there and waiting until 5 o'clock, then they start to move. Just take photographs, document that, and then make that accessible to citizens who then could engage in activities to change this unjust situation that we have.
Okay, so the themes are self-reliance, self-organization, applauds from Marcus on the street committees, and then of course a broad left front. These are themes that are emerging, and these are things that we need to take forward into areas such as focus. Okay, so the other hand was it Lucy? Herbert?
It was Herbert.
Herbert?
Yes, can you hear me, Zulaikha?
From
Yes, I can
Namibia.
hear you very well.
Yeah, all the way, Marcus, from Namibia. Lucy is also here, and we really want to appreciate what you said and what you were doing. Sorry, the picture seems to be a bit weak.
Okay, perfect. I can see you both now. Yes.
Okay. And really, congratulations to the speakers. What you've done was brilliant in relating what happens to Cuba to the global situation, and in your case to South Africa. And I liked what was said, and that I think is really the key issue. It's not a coincidence that Cuba was targeted. Likewise, it's not a coincidence that Venezuela was targeted with equal sanctions since the Chavez era, because they point to a new model, to a new way of organizing society, of organizing life and the economy. And that runs contrary not only to imperial interests, but also contrary to our kleptocratic local elites. I mean, what the ANC is doing is a comic book right now, but you see it across the region as well. In Namibia, the way the fishing resources were privatized by a handful of people for utterly corrupt practices, which could have financed on their own, for example, a basic income grant for all. So the kind of pattern that Cuba and Venezuela were setting, that the collective sharing of resources, that the collective matters more than individual interests, that is seen as a threat to the system as a whole. And that's why countries that go another route will be targeted. And if South Africa would change radically left, you will face it. Namibia would do it, we will face it, and so on. So I thank you very much that you've drawn this parallel so beautifully between the imperialism, but also how the emerging alternatives have to be killed, basically kill them before they grow, as Bob Marley said. Thank you very much for this really inspiring debate.
Thank you, Herbert. Hi, Lucy. Do you want to say anything, Lucy? She doesn't want to. Thank you, Herbert. Thank you for your contribution. Herbert and Lucy are based in Namibia, and they are part of the Venezuelan solidarity movement from Namibia. But there's also a strong Namibia-Cuba Friendship Association in Namibia. They unfortunately couldn't join the Zoom today because of technical issues. Okay, so are there any last minute final questions to the panel? Kristen, Sheppy, and Robbie. Let me have a look at the chat. And I must adjust my specs. Maybe I need new specs. If there's anything new, Fatih, was there anything that stood out for you in the chat group?
No, it's just people that need to leave for other sessions.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, so I think that brings us close to the end of our discussion. And I think that, okay, so maybe before I give thanks and acknowledge everybody that's been part of today, I perhaps maybe just need to talk about next week, that same time, same place. We will watch the screening of part 2 of the documentary series. We've got different speakers. The first speaker is Professor William Gumede. I think he's a colleague of yours, Robbie, at the Wits School of Governance. William, we normally see on ENCA, but next week we are fortunate to have him on Focus Western Cape TV. So watch the space, please join us. And then our comrade from Namibia, Comrade Vicky Yatoiva, she is representing the Namibia-Cuba Friendship Association. She will join us. Fatih, are there any confirmed speakers from your side for next week?
Not yet, but we will send out the message by Monday with a full list of speakers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so all that's left is just to thank everybody. I think let's start off by thanking all of you that attended today. And again, apologies for those that couldn't join the Zoom discussion, but is following us on Facebook. You not only extended, but reinforced our commitment to Cuban solidarity. I must also thank and acknowledge Iwewe Yekani. He is a young and talented designer, and all those posters and pamphlets that you see in the digital landscape, advertising, promoting today, that is from Iwewe. If you need his services, you can contact us. And then, of course, we have to thank the members of Focus Western Cape, all of you that gave your support for today. It would be remiss of me if I did not thank Comrade Jensek Fati, and we can see her energy and a vision in today's program. And I think, of course, we need to thank our panel, very powerful and robust panel. They gave us insights. We saw the comments from people. It was inspirational. Thank you so much for your time and commitment. And thank you so much for your time and commitment in support of the Cuban people and for allowing us to consider applications and interventions and the future for South Africa of the Cuban model. I think, I hope I didn't leave anybody out, but thank you very much for today, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place. Before we go, I did see the speakers referring to a written piece that they spoke to, and I wonder if they wouldn't mind sharing that with us, that we could share on our platform, given the interest in their contribution today. Would that be possible?
Yeah, we could send, if we could send it out to our mailing list, that would be great.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah, and also just to thank Saliha for for all the energy she put in getting the speakers and putting it together and facilitating the session, the commitment, and very professional and warm. Thank you very much and very insightful. Thanks, Saliha.
Thank you, Fatih. Thank you, everybody. And lovely to see you all again. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.